The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland. From the University of Maryland, this is Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff. Since the fall of the Communist Party in 1991, Russia has struggled to emerge from over 7 decades of economic and social stagnation. Critics charge that the country is backsliding into authoritarianism under President Vladimir Putin, but some believe he is the strong medicine Russia needs to make the transition to capitalism. Is Russia still making progress? And what is the legacy of former Presidents Mikhail Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin? To find out, Policy Watch is joined by Susan Eisenhower, Senior Fellow at the Eisenhower Institute and author of Breaking Free, a memoir of love and revolution. And now, Doug Besheroff.
Susan Eisenhower, welcome to Policy Watch and the University of Maryland.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
It's wonderful to have you. Let's talk about the startling events that led to the fall of the Soviet Union. And I just finished reading your book, Breaking Free, a memoir of love and revolution, and it's just a wonderful book to read. You called the beginning of that revolution the awakening of an entire nation. What did you mean by that?
Well, it was extraordinary. I made my first trip to the Soviet Union in 1986 as part of a conference. It was the first open policy debate ever conducted in the Soviet Union, and it was done in front of live television cameras for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, and it really shook people. I mean, they all came out of their workplaces and sat next to the television. They'd never seen American and Soviet leaders debating each other in front of a huge audience, actually, of about 2,000 people. And it was a very tense time. It was in the middle of the SDI debate, Strategic Defense Initiative debate. There were so many issues on the table that were intractable. And the conference itself was held in Latvia, which was a part of the Soviet Union at that time. And so there was the whole overlay of the captive nations notion. And it was a very tense time. And people didn't know about their history. Frequently, American public officials would get up and tell the Soviet people things they didn't even know were going on themselves. And during the next couple of years, this conference was really used as a trial balloon, I believe, by the Gorbachev regime. This notion of glasnost became the watchword, and people began to learn more about their past. And it was extraordinary to see this country come alive with questions and begin to furnish the empty chapters of their history.
You know, I think the conventional wisdom is that Gorbachev misjudged with glasnost. He thought he could have openness without undermining the regime. Is that your sense as well?
Oh, I think so. I think he wanted everyone to feel that they could now talk about the issues that needed reform in society. He had no idea, I believe, what people really thought and felt. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union had done very well for Gorbachev. He had grown up in an occupied part. This is a German-occupied part of the Soviet Union during World War II. And it was the Communist Party that really gave him the opportunity to move beyond what was regarded as public shame if you had lived in an occupied territory. So he had a kind of fondness even for the Communist Party that was not shared by anybody else, I think, except a few hardliners. And that may sound like unconventional wisdom, but his book Perestroika was really about bringing back fundamentalist Leninist socialism.
Did he have any idea how much the Soviet economy had broken down?
I don't think he understood the dynamics of the economy. I'll tell you one thing he didn't understand, most importantly, was ethnic relations within the Soviet Union. He was the only president, except for Lenin, who had not lived outside of the Russian Federation proper. All the other premiers of the Soviet Union had lived in places like Ukraine and other parts of the country. So Gorbachev had no sense of what a volatile mix a declining economy and rising ethnic awareness could mean for his country.
I have had only minor interactions with things Russian, but it seemed to me that that process in the 1980s was what you could almost call a great disillusionment. I think many communist members of the party believed in socialism. It is, after all, a very attractive thought that everyone's needs will be met. But I think that as Europe became wealthy, it became more difficult to hide the poverty of the Soviet Union. Did you see that? I remember seeing Russian diplomats coming here and they're arriving in their drab clothes and within a day or two having pink shirts on. I remember this very well.
Well, I think probably one of the smartest long-range plans we undertook was to establish regularized exchanges between the United States and the Soviet Union, because this exposed the political elite to the West, not only to fresh ideas, but also to the standard of living that was enjoyed in the West. And this had a very, very big impact. George Orwell said in his seminal book, 1984, that there are a number of ways that, number of factors that will bring about the collapse of a regime, but the most important is the attitude of the ruling elite itself. And he was completely correct about that. That is really one of the reasons the Soviet Union collapsed the way it did, is that the people who were members of the Communist Party didn't have confidence in the party or in the system. And Brezhnev-era stagnation created the conditions that really shook the whole system loose.
Yeah, I was at Shannon Airport in Ireland, and a Russian plane came in, and these were clearly big shots with big military hats and so forth, but I was struck by the kinds of clothes people were wearing and the plastic shoes, and they went to the duty-free shop, and I just watched them stare at everything in the duty-free shop. Well, I found this in your book, and we're right now worrying about how the CIA got Iraq so wrong. And of course, the CIA got the power of the Soviet Union very wrong. And this is a passage I found from your book, this is you writing, but our bus ride through the forlorn streets of Leningrad on the morning of our arrival was a profound shock to me. Nothing had prepared me for how much it had failed. The glory of Peter the Great city was covered in dust and decay, a wreck of crumbling facades and so forth. Where was the CIA through all of this? Did they not know that the economy there was in tatters?
Well, not only had they overestimated Soviet power, but they also failed to predict the collapse of the Soviet Union. I was sounding like a mad woman. I would come back from trips to the Soviet Union and say the atmosphere there feels so tremendously unstable. And by the time they started forming human chains of people holding hands along the whole border with Russia and the Baltic republics, it felt like the whole thing could come unglued. And yet, during the coup of August of 1991, American leaders were getting their talking points to encourage the continuation of the Soviet Union. George H.W. Bush went to Kiev just before the collapse of the Soviet Union and was telling Ukraine that it needed to stay with the Soviet Union.
Someone once called that the Chicken Kiev speech.
The Chicken Kiev speech, never to be forgotten. Exactly right.
Well, you had a unique view of these developments, and you got to observe and interact with many of the key players. So, who is, if I pronounce this wrong, I apologize, Roald Sagdiev? Oh, well,
Roald Sagdiev is actually my husband now, but at the time he was advising Mikhail Gorbachev on arms control issues and science and technology issues. And we met at a conference in 1987. I had already been traveling to the Soviet Union a considerable amount, but when I met him, we became colleagues. We worked on a book together, and over time it blossomed into a romance. But I must say, he gave me a roller coaster ride from which to see these events, and it was probably the most frightening experience of my life. This is probably the reason I look at contemporary events in Russia today and hear people say that Putin is a soft Stalin, or I hear them say that the country is repressed. And I think, well, you know nothing about what the conditions were like in 1985. Russia today is so completely different than it was in 1986. All of the factors that are leading them to do one thing or the other are factors quite separate and apart from communism.
Let's go back to that in a minute. Let me just, talking about people like your husband, like Andrei Sakharov, I think those of us in the West could never understand how they maintained their internal intellectual freedom and imagination. You used the phrase internal immigration. What did you mean by that?
Well, it's a fascinating concept. It's actually a Russian concept. They call it going into internal exile, which means that you go inside yourself and you tend your own emotional and intellectual garden. And during Soviet time, that was regarded as the noblest thing you could do. That it was regarded as immoral to get yourself mixed up in the dirty political process that was controlled by the communist government. That, of course, began to change when Gorbachev challenged everyone to come forward, to come out of internal exile, which is what they did with a vengeance. He was not prepared for what had gone on inside of people's hearts and minds intellectually, because when they came out of internal exile, what they were telling him about what they wanted for their future was not anything he was prepared to hear.
One of the most famous people in internal exile was Andrei Sakharov, and you got to not only meet him but socialize with him and go to the can together.
Well, I must say that Sakharov may have been the one exception, and I do think this is why the CIA and the West never understood the dynamic I just described. Sakharov was the one person who had come out of internal exile, who undertook hunger strikes and protests against the government. The missing cultural piece of information here for us is that he could do that because he had received so many awards as the father of the hydrogen bomb that the regime could never really do anything too much to him. They could send him into exile to Gorky, but they would never send him to the Gulag because he was symbolically too important to the Soviet authorities. His protégés, however, who did try and speak up at certain points, were sent to the Gulag in some cases for a very long period of time. So Sakharov was a little bit of an exception, and I think here in the West we thought, well, if Sakharov can speak up, everybody else can too, but they really don't want to. I think Sakharov misled us into thinking that the silence of the Soviet people was actually an endorsement of the system. So everyone was shocked when communism collapsed, but I never met a true believer the entire time I traveled there during those years, except maybe Gorbachev.
So a little bit about Gorbachev. Here, almost even today, he's viewed as a great liberal. But from passages in your book, he doesn't sound like a great liberal.
Well, I think Gorbachev is going to be regarded as one of the great historical figures of the 20th century, and rightly so. I think it can be said that in the end, it's not so much a question of liberal or conservative. At the end of the day, he made the crucial choice. He had the choice to crack down and use military force against his own people or people in Eastern Europe, and he stood back from that temptation. He flirted with it. He flirted with it in Tbilisi. He flirted with it in Vilnius. But he stepped back from massive repressions to take the country back. And that is a very courageous decision, and he will be always respected for that. But in the end, he has to be seen as a man who has failed in his own frame of reference. He started out to reform the communist system and ended up not only losing the communist system, but the cohesion of his country.
Which at one point spanned from Eastern Europe to the Pacific. Putin recently said that the breakup of the Soviet Union was the major event of the 20th century.
Well, I think Putin should have said the major event of the 20th century for Russia. And I think even if he'd said that, he would have raised some controversy, because I would have thought that losing 27 million people during World War II would count more. But I think what he was really saying, and it wasn't very artfully said, is that it was a catastrophe for the Soviet Union in terms of economic ties, and let's not forget social and personal ties. There are a huge number of couples that have intermarried. The country was never set up to be split up. And so you have 20 million Russians who don't live in Russia anymore. You have many millions of other ethnic groups that are not living in their homeland.
And you have nukes, or you had nukes all over.
That's right. You have Russia's most important nuclear weapons facility now on the border between Russia and a foreign country. Back in Soviet time, it was deep in the heart of the Soviet Union. In fact, in terms of early warning capability, the Russian government cannot tell 24/7 whether or not the country is potentially being attacked by first strike missiles from the United States. Why? Because the early warning centers are now in foreign countries. And so the ramifications of the collapse of the Soviet Union have been huge for everyone who lives in that space. And I have to say that I think if you take the long view of history, you've got to stand back and say it's remarkable that there has been so little bloodshed given the multiple revolutions that were occurring simultaneously.
Yeah. I was in Russia in about 1994, I think it was, and I can remember seeing American consultants everywhere. I remember a busload of police coming to give advice about how to police, and I scratched my head and said, I don't think we do such a good job in the U.S. What are we doing coming here?
Well, this was a huge problem. American consultants, and actually Western consultants in general, sort of swept in to offer lots of advice and really not very much money that ever directly was spent in Russia. It paid for a lot of consultants' fees. The problem is that nobody had ever seen an economy like this, and I remember being at conferences where experts on the Guatemalan economy were being sent to Moscow to offer advice, and I actually heard one expert say, well, you've seen one economy, you've seen them all. I don't really think this is true, as we now know. And I think we had this idea that it was a command economy, and therefore you could shake certain pieces loose and then it would create freedom. The problem is it was actually, in my estimation anyway, a feudal economy moving to a market economy where each of these enterprises was led by a director who had full responsibility over the housing and the food and the pharmaceutical resources for each of their employees. This is a very different model than anybody has ever seen in terms of making this huge leap. And so some very big mistakes were made in the beginning, the most important of which I believe was a failure to encourage a rapid breakup of the monopolies in Russia, because if you didn't break up the monopolies, then when you freed prices, you actually enabled monopolies to set whatever price they wanted to.
And the creation of these oligarchical fortunes with billionaires who it's a little difficult to tell how it happened.
Well, it happened through all kinds of schemes and revolving around a number of measures that were taken, including auctions of principal strategic state assets, and major oil reserves went for pennies on the dollar. And then you had loans for shares. You had voucher systems that were given to Russian people, and these guys would zoom into town and buy these vouchers for virtually nothing because people were suffering so much from shortage of food and other things. And so you had a period of chaos. It was everybody's objective to get all of this done as quickly as possible so that the country wouldn't go back to communism. But what drove me absolutely nuts is that by 1991, I felt pretty confident that the other shoe, that is, that the communists were going to come back to power, would never happen. That the Russian people were absolutely inoculated against a historic experiment that had completely failed for them. But because the West was so concentrated on Gennady Zyuganov, the head of the Communist Party, he's got 20% of the vote. Is that all? I mean, that's not 80%. And we focused so much attention on breaking the system so that it couldn't be put back together that, now they really, they've got a mess on their hands.
And you seem to be, you're describing, in fact.
I say we. I mean, the Russians, believe me, were taking our advice and coming up with some pretty wild ideas themselves. But this was not an orderly transition economically. And Boris Yeltsin was not on the job as much as he should have been. So what you have today is a number of major time bombs that were set in the mid-90s that Putin has to defuse before they blow up. And so I think the bottom line on Vladimir Putin is we're all glad we don't have his job.
So what are those time bombs?
Well, first of all, of course, is the economic time bomb, which is that basically speaking, 12 people own the country. I'm not exactly sure of the figure, but I believe that they own 80% of the assets of Russia. Many of these strategic assets that are, by the way, in state hands in other responsible countries have been privatized. And so there is obviously a review of that policy. And also metallurgical factories that provide essential components for military hardware. These are now owned by, are in private hands and that type of thing. So the fact that 12 people own so much of the country is obviously not good because they are consolidating power rather than creating a leveler playing ground. Another time bomb, of course, was ethnic, was the question of Moscow's relationship to the regions. There are 89 of these, and of course the most famous being Chechnya, where the government is still involved in a fruitless confrontation with Chechen rebels. And that, of course, so the first war in Chechnya was started in 1994 in a very ill-advised way by Boris Yeltsin, who then went on to actually sign treaties with other regions. Why that wasn't tried in Chechnya is beyond me. And I think those are really two very major issues, but there are still so many other issues related to the transformation that's taking place in the simple restructuring of the economy. For instance, so much of what Russian people have today are still part of the old system. They don't have to pay rent on their apartments that they own. And the state's trying to figure out how to monetize the benefits they have, like free housing and virtually free utilities and free transportation for people of a certain age group. And they're trying to figure out how to put a monetary value on that, and then they can move to a system where you have people paying rent and you have landlords and all this sort of thing. You have a new system that's growing up in parallel to the old one, but they haven't been able to unify these two systems. And of course, when you start talking to people about their health care, their transportation, their housing, you're into a very, very difficult social problem. And there have already been big demonstrations all over Russia criticizing Vladimir Putin for his policy on this. And if you want to read some pretty stinging criticism of Vladimir Putin, open the Russian newspaper, because when they instituted this benefits reform, it was met with a chorus of protest across the country. So the government is now in retreat. But these are all these time bombs, son.
They're giant ones. And,
they're giant ones. Right.
But let's go to this question of Putin. I know you feel strongly that, again, the West, and especially the U.S., is misreading what's happening in Russia and maybe misreading Putin?
Well, I think, first of all, the situation is considerably more complicated than the way we read it in the newspaper. And I think it would behoove us to be a little bit less critical and a little bit more engaged with the Russians on how to solve these problems. I don't think our society here would survive if we had as many parallel crises unfolding at the same time. Whenever we overdo it in the West, it only gives platform to the hardliners who say, you see, the West never wanted to be friends. The West never wanted the Cold War to be over. We're just going to have a Cold War again, so we might as well prepare for it. And there is a lot of pressure coming from hardliners and conservatives in Russia who say that the West has not delivered on the strategic partnership that we had agreed to after the Cold War. And I'm very worried about this. These are people with a point of view. For a long number of years, they had disappeared into the woodwork. And I think we have to recognize every day that we have been given such a historic opportunity to be able to cooperate with the Russians on reduction of nuclear weapons, to cooperate in space, to cooperate economically, and especially in the energy area. And so when we go to give them advice about how they should be organizing their society in the midst of these multiple crises, we ought to be sure that we do so in a constructive way, so that we don't lose what has really been an opportunity that our ancestors could have only dreamed about.
I think that's a tremendously important topic. In our next segment, let's explore that some more. In the meantime, Susan Eisenhower, thank you for being with us at Policy Watch, coming from the University of Maryland.
So nice to see you.
This program was produced by the University of Maryland, which is solely responsible for its content. The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland.
We are PBS.